For 4 decades, my father's directive in documents and depots and things like that was that each daughter inherit one half of the estate. And so it was very straightforward. It's 50-50, two daughters, two condos, a huge estate smack down the middle, and it's going to be inherited by the two girls. However, as it turned out, only one of the two daughters inherited the fortune and one of my four children. So you have one daughter and one grandchild taking it all. And I, along with my three other children, were each given $1,000. $1,000 from an estate that is worth millions and millions and millions. And they took my home too, and everything in it. Ultimately, the two documents were finagled in such a way that sibling and son could walk away with all of it, leaving me and my three other children out in the cold, literally. And so, because it was such a travesty of justice, and I felt it was corruption to the hilt, as my parents and grandparents, had worked their entire lives to amass a fortune for all of their heirs, not just one daughter and one grandchild. And so my parents and I wondered if Scott and Irene had really been working together the whole time to kind of mastermind this theft of my marital estate as well. And now my parents' estate, they didn't know that it was actually happening, but they did. They were concerned. And so there was thieving of trust funds, of money market accounts. There was thieving of investments and IRAs and real estate and art and jewels and precious metals and priceless antiques and more. And the thought of that much betrayal was just too much. And I just kept saying, it just can't be. And my father and I met with various attorneys then to protect my inheritance. And so they gave us several options, actually. One was to store my valuables in my parents' condo in sealed boxes, and luggage. They said put it in suitcases, whatever, and put it in the spare bedroom, in the walk-in closet. My dad knew that Irene and Scott had extra keys to my home. Oh, I didn't tell you about 417. So when I decided to move to Florida after there was a professional break-in attempt in my condo, I was living at that time in Lake Forest, Illinois. And after this professional break-in, I had gone to see the FBI and law enforcement and things like that. And they said, if you're feeling that afraid, then you should leave, because your story is just pretty big news around here. And they don't want the truth out, actually. What you need to do is make sure that you tell the truth. And then why stay in a place where it's just so hostile? So that day, I ended up packing up and taking a taxi. I think they had taxis back then, to O'Hare, and I flew out. It was one of the ways to protect my assets was to store them in my father's condo. Here's a conundrum I had, and it's another aside, and it's that my father had actually given me a bag of gold coins, and there were sleeves of Cougarans, and then there were several other very rare and antique gold coins, and they were worth a fortune. And so my father gave this to me, and I'm sitting here thinking, okay, well, it's not safe in my condo because my sister and my ex-husband, who were plotting against me, had keys. And so what do I do? So my father said, I don't care what you do, but you can't leave it in my condo either because they have keys to that too. So he said, figure that out. So I had a safe deposit box, but during the divorce, at one point Scott had said that something was missing from the safe deposit box. And even though I never went in there after I had gotten some of my things out of there, the judge allowed him to go into my safety deposit box. And, and he claimed that I had stolen things. So the divorce judge let him help himself to my things. And I thought, that's just wrong. So I thought, I don't want a repeat of that, where he's going to then go into my bank box and take the gold coins that my father had given me and didn't want to be left in the house. And so that was so ridiculous. So anyway, I had a friend, and he was actually my dog's veterinarian. Anyway, he said a vault, a ceiling vault in his garage, and so he volunteered to put my stuff in it, and then I would be able to take it anytime. Well, I ended up doing that. Of course, when I asked for it back, he disappeared. He did not return any phone calls or communication. So I heard he moved from Florida to Idaho and bought a ranch, probably with my fortune or just those coins, which was a fortune. And so may karma find him. I mean, yeah, that was just a horrible thing. And plus, in Clearwater, there are a lot of Scientologists. It's I think it's the headquarters, one of the headquarters, and he was a Scientologist, and he had prided himself on being um, so uh, above board and so ethical and honest and everything else. And for him to do that, because he said, oh, he has to report everything he has. So I wondered if he wouldn't even return it. I doubt that he reported that he had all this money, and because he did have like separate accounts in the Caribbean. So anyway, but that was just wrong. And so I've called him and I've tried to reach him, but he just acts like, just like my sister and my son, they act like I just don't exist. And so, and given my financial situation, I wasn't going to go to bang on his door in Boise, Idaho, or wherever he was living. The second way that attorneys recommended that my father and I protect my inheritance is I could assign all my assets to my father, because for years my father had been giving me a lot of money and as gifts. And I had furniture and clothing and antiques and things that were in both condos, actually, because I had more than I could really fit in my condo. And because they were so beautiful, my father said, well, just bring them in our condo. So I did. And he said, and I'll return them to you as part of your inheritance, because I'm going to leave them to somebody, right? And so your sister doesn't need to get in half of these. This is yours. And so I'm going to leave all these to you as part of your inheritance. And so that was the second way that we were going to protect my assets. And then the third way was that both condos, my condo that my father bought me and the condo that my parents lived in, they lived in 414 and I lived in 417. Both of those condos would stay in my father's name and they would be part of the inheritance. And also an issue of $16,000, and that was for the porcelain tile that I put in the condo. And my dad said, oh, well, since it's still in my name and it won't officially be yours until I pass on and until the estate is divided, I'll pay for it. And so he said, give me a copy of the receipt. This is so silly if I hand it over for you, because I have to sell some investments and things like that. He said, I'll just keep this receipt and you will get, before anything's divided, you'll get 16,000 off the top of it, and he'll add it to my inheritance. And so I thought that was fair. I was fine with that. And the other thing, in order to protect my inheritance, was that some of the attorneys suggested that I be removed as co-executor of the trust, because there was a fear that actually Scott would sue me and he would kind of worm his way into the estate by filing litigation against me, and it would then hold up the timely distribution of the estate. And so I would still maintain my other designations as trustee and things like that. But anyway, so I said, fine, take me off as co-executor if you want. And this was like at a family meeting. My father would call these meetings, and my sister would come on over, and so it would be the four of us with my mother until she was put in a home. The other thing that the attorneys advised was for my dad to list me as sole beneficiary for my mother's IRA at Merrill Lynch. And they had two IRAs, one for my mother and one for my father. And my mother's was several times more than my father's. My father's had a couple $100,000 in it, from what I understand, and he had shown me the papers. And then my mother's of several $1,000,000. And so my father wanted me to know that regardless of litigation, that Scott would try to delay my receipt of my inheritance. He couldn't touch an IRA, and the attorneys had suggested this. And they said, and in the event of a battle or whatever, you have this money, and it's yours, and no one can touch it. And so we decided to do that. And he even showed me the statements for both IRAs, and so that was fine. I knew that um, that I had that money no matter how many times Scott was going to sue me, and until that was all resolved. Another option was to set up a special needs trust. And I would be the only one that would benefit from that. My oldest son, Peter, of whom I had sole custody, he would be the trustee. And so he understood that we were protecting the estate from Scott. He was right on board, and he said, absolutely, I will do anything I can to help my mother. And so as it turned out, we ended up aborting that last option because he had seen some red flags. And remember, I said that the day after the defamation judgment, Peter was spooked. He said, Dad can just ruin me if he just calls my boss. And so I think at that point, he just decided that he needed to look out for himself. And he didn't want to be broke and homeless like I was. And so he ended up siding with his father. So that's why it was the three of them. But I realized that, yes, his integrity and his loyalty were seriously in question. And so that's why we kind of aborted that last option. I noticed that Peter was kind of parroting his father. Maybe he was just trying to save himself. So whatever, I don't want to get into that. But at the same time, I know that I couldn't trust him. And that was very, very painful for me. And I assume that it was very painful for him. He would come to my home in Clearwater, and he was setting up my computer so that he would be able to control it in London. By this time, he moved to London. And so he would kind of like, in front of people, he would demean me and belittle me. And I thought, that's really weird, because that really wasn't the Peter that I knew. But I had this feeling that they had cameras around, and so my ex and Irene were watching me. And so he needed to prove to them that he was all on board. And so he was going to kind of demean me and to let them know. And so again, I have no proof of this. I'm just telling you as a mother, when I noticed my child's behavior that had switched on me, so like that, I thought, I don't really trust him to be a trustee over all of my money, right? And so anyway, and things did deteriorate. And then when I did call him, I think in 2012 or 13, when I found out that they had switched my name on the will, and he got it. He got my home, he got everything. And I think I mentioned that, in fact, I told him he could have the condo as long as I had a place to live. And he said, call my attorney. I'm not going to give you anything. So that was kind of the end with Peter. But I did notice that there was so much betrayal. And within a family situation, it's chilling, actually, to learn that for years there have been secret conversations, between my ex-husband and my sister, or between the three of them, the ex-husband, the sister, and the son. and how to try to manipulate in order to steal the money and steal the home. And it's I personally just find it just well, it's chilling, but it's also heartbreaking because um, I just never imagined. And I think that a lot of people would never imagine, and yet that's exactly a common mode of behavior. It's almost like they team up against a person who has what they want, and they will then go to any extreme in order to get it. And I just found this so utterly uh, disgusting, actually. Scott and Irene would joke about poisons quite a bit when we would be together. And I remember right after I gave birth to one of my children, and I remember going home and being sore and sleep deprived and everything. And they were there together, and they were telling jokes, and it was like it was almost like sadistic, you know. It was like, oh, um, yeah, well, we're going to make you laugh so hard that you're going to pop your stitches, or, you know. And I was like in pain, and it was really weird. And so I just ignored it as best I could. But there was like this underlying current of cruelty. That's what was going on. And they were conspiring, and I just never understood. And so I talked about the defamation judgment, you know, where it was totally false and fake and bogus and unlawful, and it was pure theater. And the news reports were on the front page of the Chicago Sun-Times on October 7th, 2006, and that was Peter's birthday. And oh, the headline read, "She must pay." So now you understand why Peter was quite unnerved by the whole thing and felt that he really needed to jump to the other side. And that was his, I think, 24th birthday. When the divorce was over, Scott had actually explained to me the who, what, where, and why of both his career, the divorce litigation, and the domestic violence. I mean, he kind of explained it all. And I was totally shocked by what I was hearing. And in terms of the letter with the defamation trial, they had provided a different letter. And yet there was absolutely not one word that wasn't true in the letter that I had written. So here you have, in this bankruptcy trial, you have Peter, who had the key to the whole case, where all he had to say is, yes, I told the divorce judge that I was terrified for myself and for my mother because I had heard my father threaten my mother. And all he had to say was that, because they had the transcripts that said that and more. And yet, during the deposition, he said, no, I never said that. And so I lost. That cost me everything. Um, to know that your first child would actually betray you to that extent. And he's living like, I guess, he's living like royalty in London off of my money, and I was living in a car. But it's these are all lessons. He needed to learn his lesson. I needed to learn my lesson. That blood isn't necessarily thicker than water, right? And that family is really not based on our biology. Family is based on people who are in alignment with you, people who are of the same frequency, of the same vibration, people who believe in the things that you believe, people who want to do the right thing, people who go out of their way to help others. It's not about going and buying and drinking and partying and stuff that he had been known to do. So we talked about the future earnings, the defamation judgment. It was $10 million and 9.7, and it was based on future earnings. And so he didn't ever have a loss of future earnings. His sending Allied moving vans to come and take all of my things was really a sham, and he didn't deserve any of that. Plus, in the trust, there was a provision called the spendthrift provision. And the spendthrift provision is one that states that not a dollar of an inheritance or of the money that we were in question could be used to satisfy a debt, especially a legal debt. I do want to tell you that one day in July 2010, when I walked down the hall, because I lived on the same floor with my father, I walked for my daily visit to visit my dad. And I had the key to his condo, and his breakfast dishes were still on the table, and his clothes and all his belongings seemed to be where he had left them. And his car was in the usual condo parking spot. But he was nowhere to be found. And so I became extremely concerned and reached out to the Clearwater Police and the Pinellas County Sheriff and Elder Care and media and public and private agencies and local hospitals and condo management and friends and neighbors and relatives and anyone that came to mind. And would no one said that they knew anything about where he was. And even law enforcement wouldn't document my father's disappearance. And they said that they couldn't file a missing persons report until at least 30 days had passed, which I found very bizarre, actually. But I was hitting one brick wall after another. Ask as many people as I could, and all seemed to downplay it. And in fact, they said, "Oh, no need to make a big deal of it. He'll come home eventually. Don't worry about Maria." And so this went on for 6 weeks. I mean, it was just, I didn't really know what to do. And so ultimately, I learned that Irene had hidden my dad from me in Morton Plant Hospital. It's one of the biggest hospitals in Clearwater, if not the biggest hospital there. Despite my having called there and asked if my father had been taken there or if he was even admitted there, but everyone deceived me. And I thought, wait a minute, this is just too weird. And so finally, on the morning of August 27th, 2010, and I remember that date because that date is the date that my grandfather had passed and another relative had passed. So it was kind of a grieving date. I was working out at the Morton Plant gym, and I saw a neighbor. She was an older lady, like in her 80s, I think, who had been dating my father, and that he was fine and he was with his daughter. And again, I thought that was a really weird message. But by that time, I had returned to my condo, and there was a voice message from Irene. And she had gone years without contacting me. But she said in the voice message that my father had just taken a turn for the worse. And if I wanted to see him, I should rush to Morton Plant Hospital room. And she gave me the room number. Well, I jumped in the car, and when I got to the front desk, they said, "Well, who are you going to go see?" So I gave them the name and the room number, and they said there is no room number like this. And so, fortunately, the woman took pity on me, and she gave me the right room number. And so, once I entered my father's hospital room, I felt like I had entered a psych ward, honest to God, and or a movie set maybe too. And there was confusion, and a nurse was filling up my father's IV, and my sister was screaming that my dad only loved her and that I didn't deserve to see him, and it was just too crazy with hysterics. And I just knew it was best to keep my distance and not engage in the acting that absolutely made no sense at all to me. And so I pulled up a chair in the far corner of the room and quietly witnessed what I saw to be an unbelievable display of theatrics. And Irene was crying to her husband that I ignore them and I don't appreciate all that she's done for me. And literally, I had no idea what she could possibly be referring to because we were estranged for years. And so she began grabbing my father's head and turning it in his direction so that he could only look at her, because here he was all tubed up. And so he, with all the masks and the tubes and the IVs and things like that, and he couldn't move. So she'd have to like turn his head to face her. And so and he started gasping for breath actually, which was really frightening. And at that point, I got up and I went to stand on the opposite side of the bed from Irene, and I put one hand on his heart and one hand on his arm to calm him, and he stabilized somewhat. But within minutes, he had taken his last breath. And so I thought, oh my gosh, I mean, it was just, at least I knew where he was and where he had been, but I didn't know anything else. and no one was going to tell me either. So I'm I don't really understand what that was all about, and I want to give people the benefit of the doubt, but it was just unconscionable, quite frankly. And so, unfortunately, the drama didn't end there because Irene insisted on a private, invite only funeral, and I wasn't invited. And so, this was also very matrixy, very 3D reality, and however you want to call it. It was spooky how people were behaving. And it was the day before the funeral, actually. I went to the funeral home, which I had to hire an attorney in order to see that I could attend my father's funeral. And at the funeral home, they wouldn't allow me to see him there either. And they said that Irene had instructed not only the hospital, but this group too, not to speak to me, and that I was not allowed to see my father. The next morning at the Greek church, I arrived early, and the funeral home bouncers were there, these big guys standing by the door to the church. And they stood there, and I said, it's my dad. I'd like to just go in and sit down and pray, and I'd like to be there with my father. And they said, no, you're not allowed to. It was almost as if, until the Queen arrived in the mortuary limo, I wasn't allowed to go in. It was just so weird because it was almost as if her arrival was such a big deal, And as she exited the car, you see these things on TV or something where someone waves, and it's just, oh yes, these are my fans. And so I just stood there with my eyes like, stretched open, and it just made no sense to me. And so during the service, the priest actually said that my father had one daughter and handed her the cross that was on the casket, as that's the tradition in Greek funerals. And so my vehicle wasn't allowed to be part of the procession, and um, and at the entrance of the cemetery, they had a fake gravesite. It was a mock gravesite, and I was told that it was because my sister didn't want me to know where my parents were buried. And she didn't want me to know the exact location. And, I could only think that, was she telling people that, like, I'm some kind of like a slasher or something ridiculous like that I would, um, that they had to keep me from my parents because what, I was just so mentally ill that I would destroy my parents or something. I mean, it was just too weird. Why would you ever do something like that or say something like that unless you really were telling people that you were concerned and they bought into it? I mean, people don't know if it's a lie, and they want to err on the side of caution, right? And so what happened was my mom then became trustee of the family fortune. And by this time, my mother was in an Alzheimer's home, in a memory care home. No one expected my mother to outlive my father, actually, because he was, as a physician, he was doing like a walking meditation 2 or 3 times a day on his balcony overlooking the Gulf of Mexico. He swam daily. He would even count out his how many grapes he would eat or how many shrimp he would eat. He was just really careful about his diet and his weight. And his parents lived in Greece, and they lived to a ripe old age, and he was going to do the same. And so it was wonderful. But for him to all of a sudden mysteriously be admitted to the hospital, and then he passed before my mother.